We begin this week with the passing of WWE Hall of Famer Pat Patterson, who died this week at the age of 79 after being rushed to the hospital the day after Thanksgiving with a blood clot in his liver. He had been battling bladder cancer for a while, which is what took Earthquake's life many years ago, John Tenta. I remember that like it was yesterday, too, because he started to become a frequent guest and a visitor on WrestleCrap. Yeah, WrestleCrap.com has been around forever. I know I'm deviating here for a second, but the whole bladder cancer thing, when I read that, made me think of John Tenta. And he's had a lot of gimmicks over the years, and they would mock him and make fun of him on WrestleCrap, but he was a good sport about it, and eventually he actually joined the website as sort of a special guest. They created a forum just for him on the old WrestleCrap forums, and he would answer fan questions, and he would be on their podcast occasionally. He was a really cool guy, and it wasn't long after that he passed away from the same thing, and that was many, many years ago. So I was sorry to hear that. But Patterson also had dementia, which had gotten progressively worse, and that comes per the latest Observer. I had heard about him having issues with dementia. I know it came up a while back when The Rock's father passed away. Patterson was very close with The Rock. He effectively helped discover him. You know, he and The Rock's father were tag team partners many, many years ago. And when his son was looking to get into wrestling, he made Patterson aware of it. And from day one, you've heard the story from day one, when he saw a young Rocky Maivia, he immediately went to Vince McMahon and said, you got to take a look at this kid. We just found the star of the future. But there were stories that came out when Rock's father passed away about the way that Patterson was behaving and some of the things he said when he got up to make his remarks that were very awkward. And apparently a lot of that had to do with his mental state and his deteriorating condition. Dave Meltzer, by the way, did a fantastic bio on Patterson's life and career in the latest issue of The Observer. I already had my notes and thoughts, kind of down on paper before doing the show here this week. I'm not even going to attempt to get into all of the history that Dave did. I mean, it reads like a chapter in a book, but you should find time to read it if you can. It is very well done. Sylvain Grenier of La Resistance in WWE many years ago. He got into WWE thanks to Pat Patterson. Pat was a mentor. He was a father figure to him, I guess, after Grenier's father passed away. He visited Patterson last month. He had noticed that he had lost about 60 pounds and was not looking well at all. And when he got him to the hospital, they found a tumor on his lung, and they had scheduled him for a biopsy. They were going to test it to see if the cancer had spread, which it probably did. But they never found out because he died a couple of days before the biopsy. But WWE put together a tremendous video tribute to him set to My Way by Frank Sinatra, not Limp Bizkit. That was also a tremendous video package WWE once put together. Very different from this one, though. This was a different My Way. Patterson was known for singing the song. He was known for singing karaoke and his rendition of the song, which they spliced into the video. So the way they did this was just tremendous. In fact, I think it may be, if not the best, one of the very best tribute videos like this that they've done for anybody. Very well done. I'm sorry to say that I missed his entire career. I missed his prime years and even kind of the tail end of his career. He was already at the very end by the time I was born, and sadly, a lot of his prime work for Roy Shire out west in California, him teaming with Ray Stevens, they were a very, very popular, very, very successful tag team. A lot of that stuff was never preserved on video. I mean, you can find a few tag matches with Patterson and Stevens working together, but few and far between. You're not going to find much. So that sucks. But a lot of what I grew up watching and loving about WWE in the 80s and the 90s was very likely influenced by Pat Patterson. I didn't know it at the time. I mean, to me, he was the agent who would show up on TV at ringside. You'd see him standing around. You'd see him at the gorilla position at Madison Square Garden sometimes if somebody was coming out to the ring in the mid-80s. Or he'd be coming out to break up fights on TV. I still remember Vince McMahon on commentary losing his mind back in 97 when Bret Hart snapped after the cage match on Raw and went on his curse-filled tirade, and Patterson came out a little bit later on, and Bret punched him in the face, and Vince McMahon lost his mind. He couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe that Bret would do something so dastardly. But to me, that's who Pat Patterson was. I didn't have the same exposure to him during his prime years as a lot of people did. He was the first Intercontinental champion. That's probably, if you're certainly a younger fan, that's probably the biggest thing you know about him, that and the Royal Rumble stuff. But he was, in fact, the first Intercontinental champion in WWE. He won the title in that famed tournament in Rio de Janeiro. I love how Michael Cole on TV on Friday night, he said that without a hint of sarcasm. They actually had the original Intercontinental title that he, didn't win it, but that he was gifted in 1979. They took it out of the vault, they dusted it off, and they had it on display on SmackDown for part of the show on Friday night. And when they threw it to Cole, he mentioned the fact that Patterson won it in a tournament in Rio de Janeiro, and he did so without so much as a hint of sarcasm or a laugh. So if you're a newer fan, you just assume, boy, I got to go on the network and find the footage of this tournament in Rio de Janeiro. You're going to be very disappointed. See, they haven't been able to locate the footage. My grandfather claimed to be in attendance that night that Patterson won the title, but I can't ask him about it because he's been dead for 20 years. So we may never know the truth. I don't even know who he beat in the finals to win. But he was the referee for the very first WrestleMania main event at Madison Square Garden to make sure that things went smoothly with Mr. T and Muhammad Ali. Those are the two big celebrities, them and Cyndi Lauper earlier in the night. But in the main event, you had Mr. T teaming up with Hulk Hogan. You had Muhammad Ali was promoted as the referee. He was supposed to be the guest referee for the match. And they realized pretty quickly once he was there, this is not a good idea. He's not going to know what to do. He's not going to remember what to do. We can't trust that he's going to remember what it is that he's supposed to do. And Patterson said, look, let me be the referee. So Patterson was the referee inside the ring, and Muhammad Ali was sort of the referee or enforcer, whatever you want to call him, outside the ring. And Patterson was there to just make sure that with the celebrities, everything went smoothly and went the way that it was supposed to go. Now, he is credited with coming up with the Royal Rumble concept based off the old battle royals that Shire used to do in his territory. Patterson was in a lot of those battle royals. Patterson won the very last battle royal that Roy Shire ever did. But Vince McMahon initially hated the concept. He thought the length of the match, it would be too long to keep people's attention, so he didn't like it. Patterson finally convinced him to give it a try. And so they did. They did sort of a dry run for it in October of 1987 at a house show in St. Louis at the Kiel Auditorium. I posted a photo several days ago. It might have been the day that he passed away or the day after. I think it was the day of. But I posted a picture of an old newspaper advertisement that was taken out in the local media for the event that night. And it was only 12 men. They did not have 20. 20 was the first Rumble, and it became 30, but technically the first Rumble had 12. So there were 12 men. There is no footage of it that is known to exist unless it is just buried deep in the vault. You know, these days, WWE, they record everything. I'm pretty sure every house show, they've got one camera running. They've probably got everything on film. Very possible they have no footage at all. Or else they would have... I'm sure they would have used it for some kind of DVD or they would have used it somehow by now. So no known footage of it exists. The one-man gang came out the winner. It was said to be a mess. They had announced that the winner of the Royal Rumble that night would get a WWE title match with Hulk Hogan the following month in St. Louis at the same building. However, during intermission, that's what they announced later on, okay? But during intermission on the show that night, they had an announcement for the following month's show, and they announced that One Man Gang would be challenging Hulk Hogan for the WWE title. And so when the One Man Gang went on to win the Rumble match that night, and he was the last man standing, people booed. Not just because he was a heel, but they booed because they already knew the finish. They inadvertently spoiled their own finish. But by all accounts, it just did not go well, and Vince McMahon pretty much wrote the idea off. That probably would have been the end of it had Jim Crockett not gone and booked a pay-per-view a few months later at the Nassau Coliseum. The Bunkhouse Stampede. And it just so happens that around that same time, USA Network, who had been working with WWE by that point for a number of years, USA Network had told the company that they wanted them to produce more in-ring specials. They had done stuff like the Slammy Awards, but they were looking for a wrestling special. And they couldn't figure out, okay, well, when are we going to do this? What kind of special is it going to be? The timing couldn't have been any better, though. Once they realized that Crockett was doing a pay-per-view in January, they said, well, we'll just book an event the same night. They're doing it on pay-per-view. We'll do a free TV special on the same night. So there's a meeting with Vince McMahon, Pat Patterson, and Dick Ebersol. Dick Ebersol used to be with NBC Sports. He and Vince had worked together on the Saturday Night's Main Event specials. They had become very good friends. Ebersol kind of became sort of an advisor. Ebersol was no longer with NBC by that point. He had started his own production company, and so I guess he just happened to be hanging around, having a meeting with Vince McMahon. And he would go back to NBC. I think he went back to NBC the following year. But he's hanging around. They're having this meeting. And they're trying to come up with an idea for this USA special. And McMahon looks over at Pat Patterson and he says, Pat, tell Dick about that stupid idea that you had. And Patterson says, first of all, it's not a stupid idea. And then he goes into the whole thing and how you're going to have, it's not the traditional battle royal where everybody starts in the ring at the same time. You have two people come out. Every 2 minutes thereafter, a new person comes down to the ring until all the men have come to the ring. And then it's a battle until there's one man left standing. And Ebersol loved it. He went crazy for it. He said this would be unbelievable for television. And suddenly Vince McMahon had a change of heart. And the Royal Rumble was born. So really we have Dick Ebersol to thank for there being a Royal Rumble. Every bit as much as Pat Patterson, because without Dick Ebersol, there is no Royal Rumble. And Patterson often laid out the matches himself, which is what he was known for. Even up until a few years ago, he's basically been retired now for years, but they would bring him in. He would be there backstage for a lot of these Royal Rumbles, and they would get his input, and he would help lay out certain spots and parts of the match. I mean, it was his baby. I know he was very proud of the 1992 Rumble that Ric Flair won. Everybody talks glowingly about it. I've mentioned it a time or two here on this podcast. And Patterson was talking about it once. He said, that was a great one. I remember that. He said, that was in Albany, New York. And Ric Flair came to the back and he had tears in his eyes and he was so grateful and so happy. I'll bet there were a lot of happy people, except Hulk Hogan, but there were a lot of happy people. That Rumble is still talked about to this day. So again, that was his baby. And that's one of the things that he is most well known for. You hear a lot about his mind. His creativity and his mind for the business, how creative he was when it came to laying out matches and match finishes. He was well known for that. He helped lay out a lot of the legendary matches that we've all seen. Hulk Hogan against Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3. The Hogan Ultimate Warrior match at WrestleMania 6. I remember when WWE aired that WrestleMania All Day Long special in 2000. It was leading up to WrestleMania 2000. And I watched the entire thing because I was a maniac back then. 12 hours of WrestleMania all day long, which was really just them going mania by mania from 1 to 15, showing certain highlights. They spliced in interviews with some of the players, and it ran all day until WrestleMania 16 went on the air that night. And I sat through pretty much the entire thing. And I remember when they got to the WrestleMania 6 main event, they interviewed Pat Patterson about it, and he had said he had tears in his eyes watching it. And the Ultimate Warrior, he went to go find the Warrior backstage when the match was over, and he found him in his dressing room, and he was crying. Just hard for me to imagine and picture this in my head, but there's the Ultimate Warrior crying when the match is over. He was just so happy. He had reached, that really was the peak of his career. But you could see he was just overcome with emotion. He was so happy with how the match turned out. Bret Hart wrote a very nice Instagram post about Patterson and said that he had everything to do with the finish to the Iron Man match between he and Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 12. Patterson was also the one to suggest to Bret Hart the sharpshooter spot in the Montreal match with Shawn Michaels at Survivor Series, and we all know what happened there. I'm more surprised that Bret would have allowed himself to be put in the sharpshooter, because he already had some, he was already a little suspect of things that were going on, and it's very surprising to me that he would even allow himself to be put in that position, but that was a spot that Patterson suggested, and Patterson has always claimed that he knew nothing. Like Sergeant Schultz, I know nothing. He was not privy to what their plans were that night. He was simply suggesting a spot to Bret, which is possible. I mean, we'll never know for sure. But there are people who find that a little hard to believe. But then there were the Stooges. Mr. McMahon's Stooges. During the Attitude Era, Pat Patterson and Gerald Brisco. Two men who were considered legends in the business, Hall of Famers. Patterson was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 1996 by Bret Hart. And now they were reduced to a couple of blithering idiots on TV every single week. Gerald Brisco fetching coffee from Mr. McMahon. Always laughed when he called him that. They turned into a couple of goofball comedy characters. The Bebop and Rocksteady of WWE. And Gerald Brisco says Patterson hated being labeled a stooge. He used to rib him about it all the time. He would say, Pat, you and I worked for 20 years, trying to have a reputation as good workers. And now, forever in wrestling, we will go down as two stooges. And he said, Pat would say, don't say that, don't say that. And Brisco would tell him, he goes, you're labeled now. You're a stooge. I love the Stooges. I got a mailbag question once, a buy or sell, on the Three Stooges, if I liked him and if I ever watched him. And I think I said I was more of an Abbott and Costello guy. I never liked the Three Stooges, but I loved the two of them. And those two were Pat Patterson and Gerald Brisco. They were always very entertaining. Brisco and Over the Edge, the Over the Edge pay-per-view in 98, with one of the best WWE pay-per-view main events you'll ever see. It was, they talk about WWE being different from other promotions. It's sports entertainment, and it's not just about, the in-ring stuff, but all the other stuff that goes into it. This was pure sports entertainment at its finest. That main event between Stone Cold Steve Austin and Dude Love. Vince McMahon was the referee. Pat Patterson was the guest ring announcer. Gerald Brisco was the guest timekeeper. They were doing everything to stack the deck against Austin and screw him over. And on the show that night, Mick Foley just wrote a very nice Facebook post about Pat. Everybody was writing about Pat this week. Everybody had some kind of story or experience about Pat Patterson because he worked with everybody. He was there for so long. And they would go to him for advice or to help lay out their matches. He was the agent for pretty much The Rock's entire career, for pretty much everything he ever did. Same thing with John Cena up until many years ago. I think Pat was kind of his go-to guy, or one of them. But Foley wrote a blog on Facebook. He singled out the chokeslam spot from that match at Over the Edge. And I have always thought the same thing. As soon as you mentioned it, I said it's like we're on the same wavelength here. The height that Pat Patterson got, there's a point in the match where he tries to screw over Steve Austin. And the referee was bumped. And Patterson reaches into the ring, and he's trying to count the three. The Undertaker is outside as kind of to even the odds, right? He's almost like there to help Austin. And he pulls Patterson out, and he goozles him, and he goes to pick him up for a chokeslam. He's going to chokeslam him through the announce desk. And the height that Patterson got on that chokeslam outside, it was the perfect bump. And he would have been, I think that was 98. He's 79, so he would have been around like 56 or 57 years old at that point, right? Well retired by then. It is as perfect a chokeslam as I have ever seen. That one, the one that Brock Lesnar took on SmackDown in 2003, where he bounced, and the one that Shawn Michaels took at WrestleMania 25. Three of the best chokeslams I've ever seen. Coincidentally, all delivered by The Undertaker. But he and Brisco also have the distinction of appearing on the highest rated episode of Monday Night Raw of all time. May 10th, 1999, which ran unopposed that night. There was no Nitro. I think they were preempted because of the NBA. So Nitro's off the air. Raw, at this point during the Attitude Era, I mean, it is reaching its ratings peak. It did an 8.1 rating on USA Network that night. And the highest quarter hour of the show that night, of those 2 hours, included a tag team match that saw Pat Patterson and Gerald Brisco beating Rodney and Pete Gas of the Mean Street Posse. 9.8 million viewers. It's insane. Insane. So the Stooges can lay claim to having, if not the highest rated segment. It might not have been as long as the Rockin' Mankind This Is Your Life stuff later in the year, but Patterson and Brisco, baby, the Stooges. They have one of the, if not the highest rated segment of Monday Night Raw history. They were part of it. They're part of history. Consider that Raw cannot even break 2 million viewers anymore. That makes it even more impressive. One of my favorite Raw segments. Them posing to Real American after they won the match, even though Patterson was French-Canadian. But it makes me sad to realize now that half the cast of Legends House, or Legends House on WWE Network, half the cast now is gone. I mean, they were, in a lot of cases, they were getting up there in age. I mean, it happens, right? People get old. But they weren't that old. I mean, people like, Roddy Piper, when he passed away, was probably 61. He was like in his early 60s. Piper is gone. Patterson now is gone. Gene Okerlund is gone. And Howard Finkel also, I think, earlier this year just passed away. And they're all gone now. Now, there is another aspect that I think has to be mentioned. If you're going to talk about the life and the career of Pat Patterson and tell stories, you're going to come across stories and rumors about him that followed him through his career, and really through the WWE portion of his career when he was working in the office, behind the scenes. In his book, Patterson came out with a book a few years ago. In his book, I thought this was a telling passage, because you really never heard him talk about it, but he did address that. This is what he said. This is what he said verbatim in his book about all of that. Said, over the years, I have just ignored all casting couch innuendo made towards me in my work at WWE. I was smarter than that. It still hurts, but there was really no way for me to defend myself. I became the disappointed wannabe wrestler's ultimate excuse for why they weren't offered a contract. And that's just silly. People who are unhappy use the fact that I am gay to get back at WWE. To all the people who have ever said they weren't hired because they were not gay, I can only say, guys, I'm sorry, you were just not good enough. His name is often associated with the sex scandal stuff from the early 90s when he and Terry Garvin, who was another agent behind the scenes who worked with Patterson, worked for him, and Mel Phillips, who was a ring announcer at the time, they either resigned in some cases, or were fired. I think in the case of Phillips, he was outright fired from WWE. It was a very big story at the time It's a very big part of WWE's history, just as much as the steroid trial was. You hear about that whole scandalous period from the early 90s. Only Patterson was brought back. And one of the reasons that Patterson's name will forever be linked and lumped in with those events, those two guys were pretty much excommunicated and never did anything again in the wrestling business. But again, Patterson was brought back. The reason that he is lumped in with those events largely is because of superstar Billy Graham. Graham knew Patterson very well. Patterson was a mentor to him when he first broke into the business. Billy Graham posted the following on his Facebook page upon learning the news of Patterson's death. He says, as most of you know by now, Pat Patterson passed away this morning. He was my mentor for 1 full year in the San Francisco territory in 1972. He told me how to do my first blade job as his tag team partner. A brilliant mind for finishes, and he was a key behind-the-scenes figure for Vince for over 2 decades. Really too many stories to tell about this icon in pro wrestling. As most of you know, I said some very harsh untruths about him on the old Phil Donahue show. Vince told me that he forgave me for those lies, but Patterson would never. And Vince was correct, proving the scripture to be true, which says, "It is not what goes in a man's mouth that defiles him, but what comes out." On the Donahue show in 1992, and what an episode it was. If you've never watched it before, it's probably still up on YouTube. I mean, where else are you going to find Vince McMahon sitting next to, literally side by side with Dave Meltzer, Billy Graham, and Bruno Sammartino talking about steroids and ring boys. On Donahue, Graham made a very serious accusation about Pat Patterson, and many years later he admitted that he made it all up. He made it all up out of spite. He fabricated it because he was very bitter at the time at Vince McMahon and at the company. And eventually Vince McMahon reconciled with him, and they put Billy Graham in the Hall of Fame, and they put his book out. I think they published his book. They put out a DVD about his career, and they even put him on payroll, I think, as a consultant for a while. And when eventually they cut him off, I don't know if they were cost-cutting or what they were doing, then Billy Graham all of a sudden, WWE became public enemy number 1 again after that. But they made amends with Billy Graham and were back in business with him. And as he said in the Facebook post, the one man who did not forgive him was Pat Patterson. And it's not hard to understand why. I mean, imagine if somebody made up a story like that about you. You probably would have a hard time forgiving them too. But WWE would look a lot different right now if not for the impact that Patterson had on the product. If you missed the Sinatra tribute to him on NXT or on SmackDown, you can watch it on their YouTube channel. It is one of the best they've ever done. And it was very cool of them to dig out the original Intercontinental title that Patterson held, the very first one. Again, they showed it off on SmackDown on Friday night. I thought that was a very cool thing for them to do.